The morning she called the cops on me didn't begin with shouting, threats, or chaos. It began with silence. The kind that feels heavy, like the world knows something you don't. As I stepped onto my driveway, coffee still warm in my hand, I saw her, Karen. Arms folded, eyes burning with the fire of imagined authority. Her SUV sat half-parked across my boundary line, tires angled like it owned the place. And then, with a smirk sharp enough to cut glass, she lifted her phone and dialed 911. I didn't know it yet, but this would be the day my quiet neighborhood became a battleground, and my driveway would become the line she should never have crossed. If you believe that truth always finds its voice, that justice eventually speaks louder than lies, and that no bully, no matter how loud, gets the final word, then hit subscribe. Because here, every HOA injustice eventually gets exposed under the light. The day began like most others, early sunlight slipping past the blinds, a faint breeze rattling the leaves, and the comforting rhythm of a predictable neighborhood morning. For years, the street had been calm and untroubled, the kind of place where people waved at each other even if they didn't know one another's names. The sound of sprinklers clicking on, dogs barking in the distance, and the occasional rumble of trash trucks set the tone of everyday life. Nothing about it felt dangerous. Nothing about it felt hostile. Nothing about it felt like the kind of place where someone could call the police over a driveway. And yet, on that day, everything shifted in a way no one saw coming. It started when I noticed the large SUV positioned awkwardly across the pavement, its shadow stretching halfway into my driveway like a deliberate provocation. There was no emergency, no shortage of space, no guest overflow to justify it. It was simply there, angled with entitlement, claiming territory that wasn't hers. I felt the familiar tightness build in my chest as I walked toward it. A lingering instinct told me this wasn't an accident. Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcer, someone who believed her interpretation of the HOA guidelines held more authority than the guidelines themselves, was standing near her mailbox, pretending not to watch. The sun hit the chrome of her vehicle, reflecting flashes of light that felt uncomfortably theatrical, as if even the morning light understood the drama about to unfold. The air carried that tense stillness before conflict, that charged moment where everything feels suspended. I approached the driveway, making no attempt to hide my confusion. Her posture didn't shift. Her chin lifted ever so slightly, signaling she was waiting, expecting, almost eager for a confrontation. Her silence spoke louder than her usual rants about grass length or street parking rules. As I reached the boundary line where my driveway met the street, I stopped. The tire marks were clear, deep impressions on concrete that had been freshly cleaned just the day before. They extended well past the public curb and into private property. It wasn't just disrespect, it was intentional. The kind of gesture meant to provoke a reaction. The kind of gesture that says, "What are you going to do about it?" The breeze picked up, rustling the trees overhead, but nothing else moved. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. It was one of those surreal moments where you realize someone has carefully orchestrated chaos just to see what it feels like to wield power over someone else. The SUV sat like a blockade, a symbol of manufactured authority, daring me to challenge it. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply looked at the tire marks again and began walking back toward my door, choosing calm over conflict. But Karen's eyes followed every movement with sharp awareness. She wanted a reaction. She needed one. Peace denied her the attention she craved, and that only intensified her determination. Before I even reached the porch, I heard the sudden click of a phone camera shutter. Then another. And another. Each snapshot felt intrusive, like her attempt to capture evidence for a crime that didn't exist. The clicking echoed through the stillness, loud and invasive. I turned, and there she was, standing boldly in the middle of the street, phone raised like a weapon, documenting a situation she had manufactured. Her expression was triumphant, almost celebratory, as if she finally had the moment she'd been waiting for. She wasn't just taking photos of the SUV. She was taking photos of me. And with each image captured, I could feel the narrative she was crafting in her mind. She was building a story where she was the victim and I was the aggressor. I could already imagine her version. I had blocked her, threatened her, refused to cooperate. But none of it was real. The truth was sitting on 4 wheels in the middle of a clear driveway violation. Still, I stayed silent. Her silence broke first. I didn't hear the initial dialogue, only the tone. Sharp, indignant, righteous. Then came the unmistakable cadence of emergency dispatch audio. The rhythmic pauses, the clipped confirmations, the escalation of drama only someone desperate for authority could deliver to a 911 operator. Karen wasn't reporting a crime, she was narrating her fantasy. The neighborhood, still locked in its quiet morning routine, now had the beginnings of a storm brewing at its center. The air thickened with tension as she spoke, gesturing wildly at the SUV and pointing toward me as if she were presenting evidence in a courtroom. A few blinds cracked open from nearby houses. A dog stopped barking mid-sound. Even the wind seemed to fade into silence. Karen ended her call with a loud exhale, one that screamed victory rather than relief. She lowered her phone slowly, savoring the performance she believed she had just delivered. The world resumed its motion, but something had changed. The sunlight now felt harsher. The birdsong felt oddly distant. The calmness of the morning had been replaced by a heavy, unsettled energy that clung to every surface. I stood there, aware that nothing I had done warranted police involvement. But Karen didn't call the cops for safety. She called them for power. Minutes passed, heavy and slow, until the faint sound of distant sirens cut through the air like a blade. Karen's shoulders straightened. Her posture shifted into a stance of rehearsed innocence. She clasped her hands, tilting her chin upward as if preparing to receive applause. The sirens grew louder, reverberating through the houses, sending ripples of anticipation across the street. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just an argument. This was the opening act of something much larger. Something more dangerous. Something that would test the limits of patience, justice, and truth. And as those sirens closed in, I realized something chilling. Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started. The distant sirens that had once felt like a faint hum now roared through the neighborhood, breaking apart the quiet morning like glass shattering on concrete. The rising wail echoed between the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and perfectly painted mailboxes, creating a sense of urgency that didn't belong here, not for this, not for something as insignificant as a driveway dispute. Yet the sound kept growing louder, more defined, until it felt like the entire street was vibrating with the approach of flashing lights and official authority. The neighbors who had cracked their blinds earlier began to fully open them now, some stepping out onto their porches, drawn in by the unmistakable magnetism of a brewing spectacle. Karen stood poised like a performer awaiting her cue. Her shoulders squared, her face softened into a fragile expression, and her hands clasped demurely in front of her. It was a transformation so sudden, so practiced, that it felt unsettling to witness. Her SUV, still angled boldly across my driveway, cast a long shadow across the pavement, creating a dividing line between reality and the narrative she hoped to sell. The sun glinted off its hood, as if putting a spotlight on the centerpiece of her complaint, the manufactured symbol of her supposed oppression. As the police cruiser turned onto the street, the red and blue lights strobing across every surface, a palpable tension rippled through the air. The engine rumbled low before coming to a stop near the curb, and the moment the tires settled, Karen straightened further, readying herself for the performance of her life. The officers stepped out, calm, observant, and clearly unaware of the petty drama they'd been summoned into. The sound of their doors opening and closing felt amplified, like punctuation marks in a sentence that hadn't been finished yet. One officer adjusted his radio, scanning the scene with a practiced eye. The other glanced at the SUV, then at me, then at Karen. There was confusion in their expressions, Not suspicion, not alarm, just the silent question of why they were here. Karen took that as her invitation to move, stepping toward them with hesitant, trembling strides, the picture of a concerned citizen who believed she had endured some terrible wrong. The air around her seemed to vibrate with the false fragility she always embraced when trying to manipulate authority. The officers listened politely, their brows furrowed, their posture stiff but professional. Karen gestured wildly toward my driveway, her hands moving with exaggerated emphasis as she pointed at the tire marks, the SUV, and then at me. Her voice, though I couldn't hear every word, carried that familiar tone, the one dripping with righteousness, fear-mongering theatrics, and forced indignation. She paced back and forth as she explained her version of events, crafting a narrative where she was the victim of some fabricated aggression. All the while, I remained standing at a distance, letting the scene unfold, letting the officers gather the information they needed before approaching me. There was no point in interrupting her. Her performance needed an audience, and the officers were her stage. The neighbors watched too, some whispering behind hands, some simply observing in silence. The street had transformed into an amphitheater, and Karen was determined to be the star. Eventually, one of the officers nodded and walked toward me, his steps even and measured. The other stayed with Karen, who continued her silent dramatics behind him. As the officer approached, the rhythmic tap of his boots against the pavement contrasted with the soft rustling of leaves overhead. The breeze carried the faint scent of morning dew and cut grass, grounding the moment in ordinary reality even as the situation spiraled into the absurd. When the officer reached me, he gave a courteous nod before scanning the driveway again. There was no hostility in his demeanor, no suspicion, just calm professionalism. He asked a few basic questions, his tone neutral, his eyes flicking between the SUV and the house as if trying to piece together what could possibly justify a 911 call. Without dialogue, without argument, the truth was clear enough. My driveway was blocked, not by accident but deliberately. The SUV sat in plain violation of both common courtesy and HOA regulations. The officer's gaze lingered on the edge of the property line, tracing the boundaries that Karen had attempted to rewrite. The air grew heavier as he looked back toward her, perhaps already recognizing the theatrical nature of the complaint. The neighbors who had gathered outside exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, some smiling knowingly. The performance was beginning to unravel, but Karen was too deep into her role to stop now. The officer stepped away for a moment, returning to his partner. Their quiet conversation carried just enough for the neighborhood to hear, tones of confusion, fragments of logic assessing the situation. Karen hovered beside them, growing increasingly impatient. Her body language shifted from fragile innocence to simmering frustration, small tics and movements revealing her slipping composure. She kept glancing toward me, waiting for something, maybe for me to break character, maybe for the officers to turn against me. But they didn't. The slow decline of her confidence seeped into the air like a change in temperature. The officers pointed toward the SUV, toward the property line, toward the visible evidence contradicting her claims. And with each gesture, Karen's expression tightened. Her lips pressed together until they turned white, her breaths quickened, and a faint redness crept up her neck. The facade of innocence was cracking, revealing the entitlement beneath. The officer nearest the SUV motioned for her to walk over, and she complied, though her steps were now stiff, almost mechanical. The morning sun illuminated her face fully, exposing the flicker of panic she tried to suppress. His hands moved in calm explanation, silent but clear, and Karen's eyes widened with disbelief. The truth was being laid before her, piece by undeniable piece. Her reaction didn't come in words. It came in the form of abrupt stillness, her body freezing, her gaze drifting unfocused as the realization struck her that this wasn't going the way she had planned. The officers weren't arresting me. They weren't lecturing me. They weren't praising her for her vigilance. They were questioning her. And in that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere. A subtle but powerful change. The sirens had drawn attention. Her theatrics had drawn judgment. But now, the truth was drawing consequences. The officers exchanged another glance. Karen stepped back, and the entire street fell silent. Because everyone sensed it. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The silence that settled across the neighborhood felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. It was the kind of silence that signaled a shift in power, a sudden rearranging of expectations. The officers stood firm, their posture composed, their expressions steady, while Karen's composure faltered in small, telling ways. Her shoulders tightened. Her breathing grew shallow. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, to validate the story she'd constructed. But the only thing she found was quiet scrutiny, the kind that exposes truth without needing a single word spoken aloud. The breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves with a whisper that contrasted sharply with the tension rippling across the pavement. The officers continued speaking calmly, pointing once more to the SUV, then to the property line, mapping out the boundaries Karen had ignored. Her throat visibly tightened, her jaw locking into place. It was as if she were physically holding back the tide of anger building within her, trying desperately to maintain the crumbling mask of victimhood. But masks have limits, and hers had reached its breaking point. The shift was subtle at first, an unsteady breath, a twitch in her eyelid, a stiffening of her posture. The officers' explanations were calm, factual, impossible to twist. They outlined the rules, the HOA guidelines, the legalities of property boundaries. Every word was another chip at the illusion she'd built. With each passing second, her world of self-created authority shrank. The neighborhood watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and a quiet sense of karmic inevitability. Karen's hands clenched at her sides, fingers digging into her palms until her knuckles turned white. Her breath escaped in short bursts. Her carefully curated performance of fragile innocence dissolved into agitation. A crack appeared in her facade, then widened with alarming speed. Her voice, once soft and trembling with manufactured fear, rose in volume, an edge of desperation creeping into her tone. Though her words were not audible from where I stood, her gestures spoke loudly. She jabbed a finger toward the driveway, toward me, toward the officers, each movement filled with escalating frustration. The officers remained unmoved. The sight of their collected calm only fueled her unraveling. Her arms sliced through the air in exaggerated arcs, her body shifting between frantic pacing and rigid stillness. The neighbors stepped slightly back, sensing the shift, bracing for the inevitable storm. Even the sunlight seemed to dim as clouds drifted overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. The atmosphere thickened with expectation. Then it happened. Her meltdown. A sudden, explosive outburst of pent-up entitlement. She stomped forward, fists balled, her face contorted with frustration. Her voice, though muffled by distance, carried an unmistakable sharpness, harsh, erratic, demanding control she no longer held. The officers raised their hands in calm gestures, trying to steady her, but she pushed past their attempt at grounding. Her words burst forth like a torrent, dripping with incredulity, disbelief, and misplaced righteousness. She pointed at the SUV again, then at the driveway, then at me, her voice rising in a frantic crescendo. Her pacing quickened, steps jerking across the pavement as if propelled by raw emotion. The unraveling was complete. Her earlier false delicacy was gone, replaced by a furious, cornered energy. She had crafted a narrative she believed the world should obey, but reality wasn't cooperating. Her face reddened, her eyes narrowed, and the wind caught her hair, whipping it around her in a wild frame of chaos. The neighborhood watched, stunned. Her meltdown wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It was a full display of despair disguised as indignation, desperation masked as anger. Her composure shattered like fragile glass dropped from too great a height. One officer stepped forward, his calm presence attempting to anchor the moment. He spoke gently, his words meant to de-escalate. But Karen wasn't hearing reason anymore. She was lost in a spiral of her own creation, trapped in a narrative she could no longer control. Her hands flew to her head, fingers pressing against her temples as if trying to squeeze reality back into a shape she preferred. The officer backed up slightly, giving her space. Her breathing quickened, echoing across the quiet street. She turned sharply, pacing in tighter circles, trapped within her spinning thoughts. The neighbors exchanged quiet glances. Some frowned. Others whispered under their breath. But no one intervened. This was her storm to ride out. Her meltdown surged again, fiercer this time. She marched toward her SUV in a sudden burst of energy, slamming her hand against the door with enough force to send a dull thud across the pavement. The metallic echo reverberated around us, drawing an audible gasp from a few onlookers. She spun back toward the officers, her face now twisted with disbelief that they still hadn't sided with her. It was as if she couldn't grasp that she wasn't the hero in this story, not the victim, not the authority, not the one in control. The officer's calm persistence only angered her more. She gestured wildly toward him, her movements frantic and disjointed. Her meltdown was now spiraling into something more uncontrolled, more impulsive. She stomped her foot like a frustrated child denied what she felt entitled to. Her voice rose again, cracking under the weight of her exploding emotions. And then, abruptly, she stopped, frozen in place, her chest heaving, her eyes unfocused, her entire body motionless except for the trembling of her hands. The neighborhood held its breath. The officers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. One stepped slightly forward, not with aggression but with caution, sensing the volatility in her stillness. The breeze cut through the tense air, rustling the edges of the moment like a page turning in a book. Karen slowly lifted her head, eyes narrowing with the cold precision of a new idea forming, a dangerous one. Her meltdown wasn't over. It was evolving. Something had shifted inside her, a decision made in desperation. Her voice broke the silence, sharp and chilling. Though her words were unclear from the distance, the intention behind them was unmistakable. Her meltdown had not burned out. It had ignited something far worse. Something that would push the conflict into a territory no one expected. And in that moment, as the air thickened once more, every instinct in my body screamed the same warning. Karen was about to take this war to a whole new level. The quiet after Karen's meltdown didn't bring peace. It brought anticipation, an uneasy, crawling sensation that something far more calculated was forming behind her rage. The officers, now fully aware of her instability, lowered their tone even further, adopting that practiced calm meant to steady people on the edge. But Karen was past steadying. She had slid into a mindset where reason held no purchase, where logic drowned beneath the weight of her bruised ego. And bruised ego, when wrapped in entitlement and misplaced authority, births the most dangerous kind of escalation. The clouds above thickened, dimming the street as if nature itself sensed the shift. The officers asked her to take a breath, to slow down, to focus. She didn't. Her eyes flicked repeatedly toward her house, toward the HOA binder she cherished like a sacred text. The neighborhood watched, sensing the direction her mind was turning. For Karen, losing control wasn't merely embarrassing, it was intolerable. And when she couldn't win through theatrics, she sought power through the only institution she believed she ruled, the HOA. The officers, having determined no crime had been committed, began wrapping up their presence. They moved with deliberate ease, ensuring the situation remained calm. They inspected the SUV once more, confirming the violation. Karen's breathing grew harsher with every passing second. They weren't siding with her. They weren't validating her claims. They were, in her eyes, betraying her role as the neighborhood's unofficial enforcer. The moment the officers stepped back, their decision clear, her face shifted from shock to icy resolve. The officers delivered their final words to her, firm yet polite, before returning to their cruiser. The neighborhood remained still as the engine rumbled to life. As the car rolled away, its sirens now silenced, Karen's composure collapsed into a simmering fury. Her meltdown had not burned out. It had condensed into something more controlled, weaponized by humiliation. And humiliation, when carried by someone who believes the rules exist for everyone but themselves, becomes combustible. She marched toward her house with the stiff precision of someone preparing for war. The screen door slammed behind her, the sound echoing down the street. Curtains fluttered as neighbors exchanged glances. The SUV still blocked my driveway, a lingering symbol of her entitlement. The tension carried on the breeze like a warning. This wasn't over. Because Karen still held one final card, one she wielded with the misguided confidence of someone convinced they were untouchable. The HOA. Minutes passed before Karen re-emerged, clutching a thick binder, its tabs frayed from overuse. It was a compilation of rules, real, outdated, misinterpreted, or entirely imaginary. To Karen, it was scripture. She walked with the determination of someone marching toward a courtroom, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on me with burning intent. The wind tugged at the pages peeking from the binder's edges, as though even nature wanted to scatter the nonsense she clung to so fiercely. She positioned herself at the edge of my driveway, binder pressed tightly to her chest. The neighborhood watched in collective disbelief as she flipped through the pages with frantic urgency. Her finger jabbed at sections, tracing lines that seemed to justify her position. Her lips moved silently, reading aloud rules as if they held legal power beyond the slabs of concrete they described. She slammed the binder shut and turned, storming toward the HOA office down the block with the momentum of someone delivering a report of national importance. The HOA office, a small converted garage serving as their meeting hub, sat at the end of the street. Its beige siding and crooked sign did nothing to warn visitors of the chaos that brewed inside. As Karen approached, her steps grew faster, her binder tightening beneath her grip. The door swung open with a force that startled even the pigeons perched on the gutter. She disappeared inside, taking her fury with her. The street remained frozen, each neighbor caught between curiosity and cautious silence. I remained near my driveway, watching the storm move from the street into the building. The minutes stretched, thick with expectation. Then the door burst open once more. Karen emerged, not alone this time, but flanked by 2 HOA board members. People known for their rigid interpretations of the rules but lacking Karen's theatrics. Yet today, they seemed swept up in her fervor. She marched ahead of them, pointing toward my driveway with the intensity of a general leading troops into battle. The board members followed, their arms crossed, their faces stern. My stomach tightened. The officers had left, but now another authority approached, one that thrived not on law but on technicalities, fines, and the illusion of power. The HOA board stopped in front of me. Their presence was quiet but imposing. Karen lingered behind them, eyes gleaming with anticipated victory. One board member flipped open a folder, scanning a printed sheet. The silence grew thick as they read, their expressions shifting subtly as details came together. Karen leaned in, whispering frantically, urging them to engage. But something shifted in their posture. Their brows furrowed, their lips thinned, their eyes drifted from the paper to the SUV, to the driveway, to me, and then, slowly, reluctantly, to Karen. A subtle crack formed in her hope. The board members stepped back, exchanging low murmurs. Karen's jaw tightened. Her whispers grew sharper. Her hands gestured wildly. She demanded enforcement. She demanded fines. She demanded action. The board members, now realizing they had been dragged into a personal vendetta disguised as an HOA complaint, exchanged weary glances. One pointed to the SUV. One pointed to the property line. One pointed to her binder. And slowly, surely, Karen's expression shifted from confidence to panic. She shook her head, refusing the truth laid before her. Her whispers turned into sharp, frantic pleas. Her gestures became jerky and uncontrolled. The board members took a step back, distancing themselves from the chaos unraveling behind her eyes. Then, everything froze. Karen's voice stopped. Her chest rose sharply. Her eyes widened with a chilling, determined gleam. She turned suddenly, not toward me, not toward the HOA board, but toward her house. And she ran. Not with fear, not with retreat, but with purpose. The kind of purpose that meant only one thing. She was preparing her biggest escalation yet. Karen's sudden sprint toward her house stunned the neighborhood into a frozen tableau. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances, instinctively stepping back, as if they sensed the direction her spiraling emotions were about to take. The air thickened once again, charged with that same heavy tension from earlier, but now sharper, more electric, as though the entire street had been pulled taut like a drawn bowstring. Every instinct whispered that the next escalation would not be small, symbolic, or petty. No, this would be Karen's defining act, the moment she chose to stake her claim on control one last time. Her front door slammed behind her, the noise cracking like a thunderclap through the stillness. For a long moment nothing moved. Even the breeze paused, as if nature itself was wary of stirring the atmosphere too soon. The neighbors, clustered at distances deemed safe, leaned in with a mix of fascination and dread. No one spoke. No one dared. The sound of hurried footsteps inside Karen's house echoed faintly, growing sharper as drawers scraped open, cabinets rattled, and something large was dragged across the floor. The HOA board members looked at one another, uncertainty clouding their faces. They had come expecting to issue warnings or pretend to hold authority over a driveway line. Instead, they had been thrust into the heart of a personal war, one fueled by entitlement and wounded pride. Their earlier confidence drained, replaced by the dawning realization that Karen's frustration had slipped far beyond policy disputes and rulebook. Suddenly, the door flung open again. Karen stepped out with a large stack of documents, folders, photos, and loose papers clutched in her arms, her entire arsenal of HOA complaints, grievances, and obsession printed on countless sheets. Pages spilled like feathers in a chaotic arc behind her, but she didn't stop to retrieve them. She marched down the driveway with the intensity of someone carrying proof of a crime that only she believed existed. Her steps were sharp, cutting into the pavement with each determined stride. She reached the sidewalk and dropped everything. Papers burst into the air, drifting like frantic birds caught in a sudden storm. She knelt, frantically sorting them into piles, arranging them in a manic pattern. The HOA board members approached hesitantly, unsure whether to intervene. Karen ignored them entirely, her fingers trembling as she flipped through photos she'd taken over the years, scenes of neighbors' garbage cans slightly off position, lawns mowed a day late, cars parked too close to curbs, porch lights that stayed on too long. She had catalogued every perceived rule violation like a detective tracking crime scenes. The wind picked up again, scattering her collection. She lunged for the papers, hair whipping around her face, movements frantic and uncoordinated. Each sheet that slipped away seemed to unravel a little more of her sanity. The HOA board watched, horrified, as she scrambled across the sidewalk, gathering papers, reorganizing, muttering to herself with wild conviction. Her binder lay open beside her, pages fluttering like a trapped bird trying to escape. Then, abruptly, she stood. An eerie stillness followed. She clutched a thick stack of documents to her chest and turned to face the HOA board and me. Her expression hardened, her eyes glowing with the desperate determination of someone convinced they had discovered undeniable evidence. She marched toward the HOA board members with rigid precision, thrusting the papers into their hands one after another. Each board member staggered backward under the weight of the flood of accusations. The wind rustled, carrying stray papers across the street. Neighbors stepped cautiously forward, watching the spectacle unravel. Karen's voice, though distant, rang with a manic urgency, her gestures sharp and purposeful. The HOA board skimmed the papers, confusion deepening with each page. These weren't rule violations. They weren't evidence of wrongdoing. They were photographs of ordinary life twisted through the lens of her paranoia. One of the board members closed the folder with a firm snap. Something in Karen snapped with it. She recoiled sharply, as though the rejection had struck her physically. Her face contorted, her breathing quickened, and an unsettling trembling overtook her. For a moment she stood frozen, staring at the closed folder like it was an act of betrayal. Then her head lifted with a slow, chilling rigidity. Her gaze locked onto my driveway in a way that made the entire street instinctively tense. The SUV still sat there, a symbol of her control, a symbol she was about to weaponize in her final attempt to win. Without warning, she spun around and marched toward the vehicle. Her steps struck the pavement in hard, echoing beats. The HOA board called after her, their voices shaky, but she ignored them entirely. The neighborhood braced, watching with widening eyes as she reached for the door handle with trembling determination. She climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. The sudden vibration thrummed through the pavement, through the air, through the lungs of everyone watching. The SUV's headlights blinked on, casting sharp beams across the driveway, illuminating the property line like a battlefield boundary. Karen gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles bone-white. Her gaze locked forward. And the engine revved. The sound boomed, ricocheting off the houses, sending a shockwave of dread down the street. The HOA board members stumbled backward. Neighbors gasped. My breath caught in my chest as realization dawned. She wasn't simply leaving. She was preparing to make a statement. A final escalation. A final act of defiance. The SUV lurched forward slightly, its tires scraping against the concrete. Every instinct warned that she was about to cross a line that went far beyond HOA rules, beyond entitlement, beyond theatric. She revved again. Harder. The SUV trembled violently under her foot. The neighborhood held its breath. The final escalation had begun. The neighborhood stood in a silence so deep it felt like the world itself had paused to witness the final chapter of a conflict that had spiraled far beyond anything a driveway should ever command. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation and remnants of the chaos Karen had unleashed. Her house, once a symbol of her self-proclaimed authority, now stood dark and foreboding, its curtains drawn, its porch still marked with the faint scuff of her frantic footsteps. Everything about it radiated the energy of a storm that had burned itself into exhaustion. But even in that exhaustion, there lingered one unsettling truth. Her final escalation had yet to fully unfold. The HOA board had already retreated, shaken by her sudden descent into irrational fury. Neighbors whispered in small clusters, their conversations drifting like low hums across the street. Children who once rode their bikes freely now lingered near their parents, sensing the tension without needing it explained. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like reminders of how far this battle had gone. And though the SUV had finally been moved, its absence didn't erase the memories of what it had ignited. As the late afternoon light softened, a new sound emerged, a soft rustle, followed by the creak of a door opening. Karen stepped outside once more, but this time she carried no binder, no stack of papers, no weapon of authority. What she carried instead was a cardboard box, heavy with the weight of documents, envelopes, notices, and years of accumulated grievances she had weaponized against her neighbors. Her face was pale, stripped of its usual self-assured intensity. Her posture, usually stiff with superiority, now slouched beneath the invisible weight of consequences closing in. She walked to the curb with measured steps, placing the box gently beside the trash bins. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. In that box were the remnants of her self-constructed power. But even as she tried to purge her past, the neighborhood knew that consequences couldn't be discarded so easily. The HOA had already begun internal discussions, the officers had filed reports, and the truth had spread far beyond the reach of her influence. As Karen stepped back toward her porch, a vehicle turned onto the street, quiet, unmarked, official. It approached slowly, its presence drawing the attention of every watching eye. The car rolled to a stop in front of her house. The door opened and an officer stepped out, not the ones from earlier, but someone dressed in administrative uniform, clipboard in hand. His arrival sent a hushed ripple through the crowd. Karen froze on her steps, her hand gripping the railing. The officer approached her with calm authority, his posture professional but firm. He handed her papers, documents that seemed to drain the color from her face as she scanned them. Her knees weakened. Her grip on the railing tightened. The street seemed to hold its breath as she absorbed the reality contained within those pages. They weren't citations from neighbors or HOA complaints. These were formal notices. Legal, binding, undeniable. They referenced false emergency reports, misuse of law enforcement, community harassment, violations submitted by multiple residents who had grown weary of her reign. For years, Karen had hidden behind the thin shield of technicalities, but now the shield had shattered. Her actions, especially the 911 call, had crossed a boundary no binder could justify. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths as she tried to speak, but the officer maintained his steady tone, guiding her through each point, each consequence. The neighborhood watched as her confidence crumbled, not in an explosive meltdown, but in a quiet, devastating collapse that carried far more weight. She sank onto her porch steps, her face buried in her hands. The officer finished his explanation, placed a final document on the step beside her, and walked back to his vehicle. The engine hummed to life, and within moments, he was gone. But the echo of his presence lingered in the air like a verdict. When Karen finally lifted her head, her expression held something the neighborhood had never seen before. Humility, fragile and uncertain. She looked around, not with defiance, not with accusation, but with a softness that suggested she understood, finally, that she had pushed too far. The weight of the moment settled over everyone. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause, leaving the world wrapped in stillness. Slowly, Karen stood and walked to the curb. She lifted the box of HOA documents, carried it back to her porch, and sat beside it. Her movements were quiet, careful, deliberate. She sorted through the papers one by one, her expression shifting between regret and realization. The sunset cast a warm glow over her, softening the edges of her frustration and highlighting the humanity that had long been buried beneath layers of control and entitlement. Across the street, neighbors watched but did not approach. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the quiet unraveling of someone who had spent years hiding behind rules instead of connection. The street, once fractured by conflict, now breathed a collective sigh as the final moments of tension dissolved into the evening air. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Karen gathered the papers back into the box and rose from the steps. She walked toward her house, paused at the door, and turned to face the street. For the first time, her eyes carried no challenge, no superiority, no judgment, only acknowledgement. A silent admission that she had gone too far. A silent request for a chance at something different. She stepped inside and closed the door softly. The neighborhood exhaled. The war was over. And in the quiet peace that followed, one truth settled across the homes like a gentle reminder. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives in silence, slips into the spaces chaos leaves behind, and restores balance without ever raising its voice.